While archaeology has revealed much about how pottery was made in the American Southwest in prehistoric times, there are certain elements of pottery making that the archaeological record has been strangely silent on. I present here my top 4 lost techniques of ancient Southwest potters. We'll look at some evidence and clues about how it might have been done in the past. We'll talk about how potters today do it, and I'll throw in a little speculation about how it might have been done back in the day. Let's get started. Lost technique number 1 is controlling the drying of clay. Controlling clay drying refers to not just keeping the lump of clay damp while you're working, but also in keeping those pots from drying too quickly and therefore cracking. When a potter today mixes up a new batch of clay, they usually want to let it sit around for at least a couple days to improve plasticity before they work with it. And so they store that clay in like a plastic bin or wrap it up in a plastic sack so that it stays damp while it sits and ages. And even once they start using that clay, it may take them weeks to use up that entire lump of clay that they've processed. Pots that are in the process of being made are also wrapped up in plastic, in between different sessions or different stages of the construction process. Handles and other appendages on pottery are also commonly wrapped in plastic to keep them from drying too quickly, to slow down that drying process. But the ancient potters did not have access to plastic. This is one of those areas that archaeology has been able to shed very little light on. At the Bailey Ruin on the Mogollon Rim in central Arizona, archaeologists found a pot that had been built into the floor of the house, and a stone slab was placed over the opening. Inside that pot recessed in the floor was a lump of processed clay. This was a brilliant idea for storing processed clay in a climate-controlled environment. They were no doubt able to keep it damp in there for a period of time. But this was just one example in one house. This is not something that was practiced all over the Southwest. How did all those other potters keep their clay damp? Matilda Cox Stevenson, writing about Zuni potters in 1904, said that they kept damp lumps of clay in bowls with cloth covering the top. This would work for a short time, but certainly not more than a day in the dry climate of Zuni. I speculate that most potters in the ancient Southwest mixed up the clay shortly before they were going to use it, and then either used it all on the pot they were working on, or any that was left over was allowed to dry and then was reground and mixed with water again when they needed it. Wrapping the clay in a damp piece of cloth may have helped prevent the drying. Of course, that would need to be re-wetted throughout the day. The same goes for handles and lugs and any other appendages on a pot. A little piece of damp cloth could have been wrapped around that to slow the drying. The second lost technology we're going to talk about is making glaze paint. Glaze paint was used in various areas around the Southwest from about 1250 until perhaps as late as the early 1700s. Unfortunately, the pressures of Spanish colonialism caused the native potters to abandon the practice, and nobody today seems to know how it was made. Archaeologists have closely examined examples of ancient glaze paint, and they have determined what ingredients were used to make it. But in spite of all that, the ability to create glaze-painted designs on pottery seems elusive to modern potters working with traditional techniques. Glaze paint recipes vary somewhat by region and through time, but yet those ancient potters seemed fairly consistent in being able to create glaze-based paint with very few failures. So the technique must have been relatively easy to accomplish and fairly tolerant of variations in techniques and materials. Most recipes contain lead. Some recipes are higher in copper. All of them contain some small amounts of iron, manganese, and clay, but the exact process for creating glaze-based paint remains elusive. The third lost technique is purifying slip clay. There is a long tradition of slipping pottery in the Southwest. Slipping just refers to applying a thin coat of liquid clay to the outside of a pot to change the color and facilitate polishing. Many clays suitable for slip are relatively pure and can be used just as they are dug from the ground, simply by soaking in water and then mixing up and painting on the pot. But a lot of clays, in fact most clays, are full of all sorts of impurities that really don't help them make good slips. They have sand and silt and little pieces of roots and sticks and all sorts of things in them that you wouldn't want applied to the outside of a decorated pot. And therefore these clays need to be purified before they can be used as a slip. Modern day primitive potters and pottery replicators use various methods to purify their clay that the ancients wouldn't have had. One way that they do that is using very fine strainers, these paint strainers that you can buy at a hardware store, to clean out all the impurities and lumps from their clay slip. Another method that's used to purify clay is levigation. This process is where you mix up the clay and water, allow those larger particles to settle to the bottom, and then pouring off those finer, purer clay particles from the top. But the ancient potters didn't have access to the superfine strainers we have today. And there's no evidence, either archaeologically or anthropologically, that they were using levigation to purify their clay. And yet, if we look at the ancient sherds, the qualities of their slips tells us that they were indeed purifying that clay in some way. I have read ethnographic accounts of southwestern peoples using winnowing to purify clay. That is, using the air and a slight breeze to separate the finer from the coarser particles. So that's one way they could have been purifying their slip clays, but they could have been using some other technique that we today aren't even aware of. And the fourth and most important lost technique is that of firing pottery. There's a strong tradition of outdoor pottery firing among the native peoples of the American Southwest. So in many cases, you can just go and look at how the descendants of these ancient cultures are firing pottery to learn how they did it in ancient times. But that's not always the case. In some cases, people fire with different materials today than they did in ancient times. Take, for example, the Pueblo potters. Today, most of them fire with manure from either sheep or cows. But in ancient times, before European contact, they had no access to livestock. And in those days, they were mostly firing with wood and with coal. So the firing process in those days would have been completely different. But we don't have any written records to tell us how they fired back then, and archaeological evidence is scarce. Also, techniques change over time, especially as different pottery styles come into and go out of fashion. Take, for example, my recent video about reduced iron painted pottery. When polychrome pottery became all the rage in the 1300s, many people stopped making that reduction-fired black on white pottery, and those techniques were lost. The same thing happened with oxidized organic painted pottery, such as Salado polychromes. In the mid-1400s, with war and chaos on the ground, that pottery type stopped being made entirely. And with it went the techniques for how to fire oxidized organic painted pottery. In some cases, archaeology can help shed light on these ancient lost pottery firing techniques. Take, for example, Mesa Verde black on white. In the Four Corners region of the United States, there are many of these stone-lined trench kilns found, and archaeologists have excavated many of them. Using the information archaeologists have recovered, pottery replicators have been able to reconstruct the process for firing a smothered Anasazi trench kiln. But not all areas are as fortunate as the Mesa Verde region. In most areas of the Southwest, no evidence of how pottery was fired in ancient times has been uncovered. Let's return to that reduced iron paint example I talked about previously. In the Cibola region, archaeologists have not recovered any information about how pottery was fired. And yet, my experiments have shown that those black on white reduced iron paint potteries were probably fired in a smothered hole in the ground, much like the trench kilns in the Four Corners region. But without any archaeological evidence, we're left guessing exactly what kind of process took place. The way that pottery replicators worked together with archaeologists to figure out how to fire an Anasazi trench kiln is the stuff of legends. Clint Swink was the potter who made the biggest contribution to that discovery. To learn how that discovery was coaxed from the very earth of the Four Corners region, watch this video right over here where I interviewed Clint Swink about that. Thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time.